Fantastic. Okay, well, I will open today's discussion session by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we are all living and working and dialing in from today. I'm dialing in from beautiful Wongal country, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to pay my respects to First Nations people who are on the line with us today. We're very privileged and honoured to have you with us today. So just in terms of just some general meeting guidelines, obviously you can unmute yourself and turn on video view during the Q&A session if you like. Faces won't be captured in the recording, but audio and voices will. Paula and Amrit, our facilitators for today, will let us know when it's time for Q&A. So please do hold off any questions until then and use chat in the meantime. Remember to select everyone in the chat box if you have no issue in sharing your question or your comment. And there will also be an easy read version of the PowerPoint presentation available on the NCOSS website after today's session. And please do, at the end of today's session, stay for a quick feedback poll at the end, which Rosalita will put up about 5 minutes before we close today. So we thought we'd start today's session by just recapping the sessions 1 and 2 that were held over the last couple of weeks. This is obviously the third in our discussion series on human rights approaches. It's been a really reflective and insightful time for most of us, as Amrit and Paula have really guided us through some really important and really fundamental principles in a human rights approach. And so we started on the 18th of May by exploring what the approach means when working with people with lived experience, using NCOSS's own lived experience framework as an example. We heard that promoting cultural safety or well-being is a really foundational practice, and that it's really people with lived experience who decide whether they feel safe in a community setting or a workplace, not people who hold the power in an institution or in an encounter. And we also discussed that people with lived experience are often the ones who themselves can identify the changes that need to be made in order for their participation to feel really empowered and safe. Then last week on the 25th of May, we pondered on what intersectionality means. So one aspect of this was about not privileging one dimension of inequality over another, and transcending the preoccupation with single access approaches. And putting this into practice would mean being guided by multiple dimensions of inequality. So for example, when we develop and implement plans like reconciliation action plans, disability action plans, diversity action plans, are they siloed or are they developed separately? Is there any reflection or relationship between the areas, and do they speak to each other? And there's a great little quote here that if intersectionality is distinctive in providing a tool to realise a more just world, we must embrace it in all of its complexity, even as it challenges us. So with that in mind, I'm so looking forward to today's third and final discussion series, which is focused on First Nations and human rights approaches. We're so honoured to be joined by our guests, June Reamer and Michelle Rogers, to chat with us about this topic today. And I'll just give some introductions into both June and Michelle's backgrounds as well. So June is a Dunghutti woman and Deputy CEO of the National Peak Representative Organisation, First Peoples Disability Network, of and for First Peoples with Disability. June has worked in the disability and community sector for over 40 years and shares her knowledge in an advisory capacity across multiple boards and reference groups, ensuring the rights and culture of First Peoples are represented, respected and protected. June has represented Australia's First People with Disability alongside Indigenous leaders at the United Nations in both New York and Geneva. June is a fearless advocate for those who do not have the opportunity to be heard, and she has shown exceptional leadership as considerable changes have occurred nationally in the disability sector. June has led multiple national conferences and training workshops with the goal of ensuring that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people do not get left behind, that they are included, and that they have culturally appropriate access to the National Disability Insurance Scheme. Thank you, June, for joining us. Now, introducing Michelle. So Michelle is a Wiradjuri woman who's been visiting on Bundjalung country in Lismore for over half of her life. Michelle has a long-standing professional background in New South Wales housing services, child protection, out-of-home care, relative assessments, cultural planning, and as a specialist in both practice and permanency. Michelle believes that by investing in families using culturally embedded practice, children can live at home safely, held in the security of their extended and kinship family webbing. Michelle believes that there are times when children need to be made safe by living elsewhere, providing opportunity for change and time for community to surround families in distress, redirecting and enabling healing space. Understanding culture as a way of living and being is essential to healthy identity, and maintaining connection to community and country is a requirement for holistic well-being. Self-determination, empowerment, and communal investment are more than words to Michelle. They are the launch pad for relationship-based practice and the foundation of engagement. Michelle is a professional presenter on Aboriginal family models of practice, which prioritise embedding cultural intelligence into everyday decision-making. She's a well-considered planner and strategist of programs and projects that enable change, strengthen kinship and family networks with considerable sector knowledge attained both through study and life experience. So two fantastic women to have with us today to chat about First Nations and human rights approaches. Thank you, Michelle and June, for joining us. And I'll now just introduce Amrit and Paula, who are our discussion facilitators for today, and we'll be having a chat with Michelle and June. So Amrit and Paula have been leading human rights education in vocational, education and community settings since 2012. They've designed curriculum frameworks, developed resources, and taught the first accredited human rights skill set for the community services sector in 2016 in partnership with the Australian Human Rights Commission. The skill set was embraced by the sector with over 200 workers from Western Sydney enrolling and completing the course. So now I will stop talking and let's get on with the business of today, which is having a fantastic discussion about First Nations and human rights approaches. Over to you, Paula and Amrit, to kick off the conversation with June and Michelle. Thank you.
Thanks, Elise. And it's a great honour to be here today. I want to acknowledge I'm on the sacred lands of the Wallamadigal and pay my respects to elders, especially to Annie, June and Michelle for it's a blessing today. I'm really looking forward to listening and learning. Amrit, do you want to just do a quick intro and we can hand over to have a conversation?
Yes, indeed, Michelle and June, it's actually, we are here to learn from you, and what we want to do is welcome you, and we feel that we are privileged to be part of this discussion. Thank you, NCOSS, for giving us this opportunity. And our approach to today will be that we'll hand over to you, we'll kickstart the discussion, we'll hand over to you, and then we'll come back towards the end, you know, to basically have any Q&A or any you know, part of the discussion that we need to. Yes, and over to you, Paula, we start.
Yeah, so I mean, I think in your bios, when I was reading about the work, June and Michelle, your work, I think just as a start, if you both want to kind of have a conversation, with the conversation seems to be the best way of listening and learning. So maybe thinking about the work and engagement in both community and the global and national advocacy space and your space in it, if you want to speak to what you've done and what's important to you in the space of human rights approaches and First Nations people.
Yeah, and also looking at what you were saying before, self-determination, empowerment, and communal investment. We want to go beyond words. So how this can move into practice. Thank you.
Thank you. So do you want me to begin, Michelle? Yeah, thanks everyone, and good afternoon. So as I was introduced, my name's Jin Rima. So I'm Deputy CEO of First Peoples. I'm actually normally residing in Gambangia country up on the far north coast, but I'm in Darwar country today in southern Sydney, and I'd like to acknowledge you know, our elders, but more importantly, you know, our emerging elders like Michelle. I get excited that we've got other people in the space and you know, and particularly now with a new government caucus, you know, the voices of First Nations people will be heard much louder and clearer, I think, in this, you know, next few years. But FPDN, so FPDN is the national peak for First Nations people living with disability, their families and carers. So we've been around over 20 years now. So most of our work is systemic advocacy, but our work comes from that human rights framework about, you know, empowering people to have their voice heard, but more importantly, you know, working alongside those people to our people to understand about self-determination and what that means in their contents, whatever jurisdiction they may live in across this land. So our work is from that human rights approach. So as a national disability peak, we've always been guided by, you know, the human rights principles about free and prior consent and around self-determination, you know, for our communities and more importantly, for our people living with disability. So, you know, as we would know, most of our people living with disability, you know, come from a disadvantaged state for lots of reasons, whether that's geographics or, you know, not having connection to a service system that's never been delivered for them. So when, you know, we're talking about human rights in the contents of, you know, First Nations people, you know, there's a lot more development that needs to be done to ensure that, you know, their voice, their narrative, their culture, their, you know, position on country is heard. And these things don't get talked about enough, you know, across our programs or our service systems and our sector. So the work of FPDN is to support that knowledge and sharing, you know, with the sector. But more importantly, you know, our work is to inform and support our communities and our individual people living with disability about knowing their rights. Because if you understand about knowing your rights to appropriate access to whether it's a service system or understanding what those barriers are to you, you know, for pursuing, you know, self-determination, it makes a difference in people's lives, you know, because what's happened, you know, with historical history, you know, for most of our community, it's about being left behind, not knowing that they're allowed to walk through that front door in the service system. And that in regards to the NDIS, you know, the principles of the NDIS was, you know, a human service system, but it's become more into, you know, a market system, and that then has laid down into, you know, our service sector. So we forget that, you know, we're talking about human services here. And that's what on the Committee of the Rights of Indigenous People or the rights of people living with a disability is all about. We're talking about individuals and their rights in regards to, you know, pursuing, you know, a lifestyle or health and well-being that, you know, includes their culture, includes their connection to country. So, you know, the work of FPDN has always been around that framework. You know, we're quite unique as an organisation. So our board is led by First Nations people living with disability or carers of those of people with disability. So that makes us quite unique in regards to working in the sector, because we are led and informed by people with disability. And that's cross disabilities. So so that conversation always comes first from our elders. Our founding elder was Uncle Lester Bostock, a Bundjalung man from the north coast of New South Wales. And he was the person that coined that phrase around double disadvantage for our communities. So, you know, being Aboriginal in Australia today is a disadvantage. So living with a disability creates a double disadvantage. And when if we break that down into the contents of the service system, an example would be, you know, at education. So we hear this from many families when they enroll their children. If they tick the Aboriginality box, they may get some of their supports met in regards to culture and connection to whatever, you know, cultural group they may align themselves with, or resources to support their cultural endeavours. But if they want to tick the disability box, they may get some of their disability needs met, but they can't get both. So that comes back to the human rights principles about, you know, empowering people to, you know, be able to live on country, be part of a cultural group, but still have their disability needs met, is a function in Australia that we still haven't, you know, changed the narrative. And so we need to work more closely together, you know, in those conversations. And you will only change and support, you know, our communities is when you're having that conversation. You know, we need to be talking to our communities about what their needs are, not what you think their needs may be. So I think, you know, I'll leave it there and I'll hand over to Michelle, and then we can collectively continue this conversation. Thanks, Michelle.
Thanks, Aunt. And all I can say is I'm really looking forward to having this yarn with you now, because I'm kind of going, wow, there's some great points that you've already raised for us to grow from. So firstly, let me just say Yama, where I'm from. That just simply means g'day or hello. It's just a simple greeting. And I guess I might take Aunt's lead here and just give you a bit of an intro and an overview of who I am, where I'm from, and what I'm up to, what I've been up to. So my name's Michelle Rogers, as mentioned earlier. I'm a Wiradjuri woman. I was born on Gamilaroi land out in Coonabarabran in Western New South Wales, so very familiar with the Warrumbungle mountain range. I spent a little bit of time in Sydney and the Eora and Derrick lands, and then moved up to Bundjalung country, where I've been now living for over half my life and raised up my Jarjams here. I have had the opportunity to work across the government sector in housing, in child protection. I've done some specialist work in relative kinship care assessment models. But more recently, and probably this is the part that's most important, is in recent years I've stepped out of the government sector and into the not-for-profit sector. So I'm now working with Nungi Jarjam Aboriginal Child and Family Service in Lismore, New South Wales, as Partnerships and Engagement Manager. Nungi Jarjam was born probably about 26 years ago on the back of a vision from local elders here on Bundjalung land, a vision that with DCJ removing our Jarjams at the rates they were back then, and we won't talk about the stats today, that'll come up later in the yarn, I'm sure. But back then, you know, DCJ were docs or facts or yaks or whatever they were calling themselves at the time, were removing our children at ridiculous rates and then placing them in non-Aboriginal foster care, often off country, away from their family and kin, in the name of protection. There was a vision that local elders had here to develop an agency whereby DCJ would be able to approach an Aboriginal community-controlled organisation to grow a kinship care model for those Jarjams that were being taken from their families. So that was basically the birth of Nungi Jarjam 26 years ago. Nungi Jarjam was the first Aboriginal community-controlled agency in New South Wales to be accredited by the Office of the Children's Guardian. Nungi Jarjam continues to be robust and sound in advocacy for the rights of our children in the care systems. In very recent years, since my demise, my growth from outside of the government sector and into not-for-profit sector, I've had the opportunity to develop programs such as a family preservation program, targeted early intervention programs within Nangyajarjan. So Nangyajarjan primarily for most of its life has sat in the out-of-home care space, so after a child is removed from their family. But in more recent years, we've been able to invest in models that actually prevent children entering care, which is where we've always wanted to be, and always been a vision for the board. So I'm now there, and I guess from there, I had the opportunity to bring some of my learning and wisdom and knowledge from working in the government sector, but also definitely my lived experience as a child who was taken into care myself and experiencing what out-of-home care felt like, looked like, and behaved like back in those days. I guess I wanted to probably talk mostly today around some of the systemic issues that happen as a result of intervention and what empowerment looks like for Aboriginal families and communities. And I'm hoping that I'll get an opportunity to talk to you about what my views and thoughts are around that by ways of reflection for us in the sector. So what else can I tell you that's really interesting about me? I'm trying to think of something no one much knows about me. You might see I play the cello. That's how I keep myself sane at the end of each day. And that's how I keep myself robust and ready and moving to keep going in this space that we work in that can be so exhausting. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. But I guess leading on to the yarn itself today, there was a really interesting yarn, Aunt, that you started in the space of reconciliation. As we were kind of entering into this meeting, we were starting a bit of a dialogue. And I'm just wondering if we could revisit that part of the yarn, if you're comfortable to go straight into that space, or if there's something else you'd like to cover first.
Yeah, I think it's a conversation, thanks, Michelle, that, we need to be having in this space. So, what I hear from community and our elders, and I work quite extensively nationally across Australia, a lot of work up in the Northern Territory and out in the Utopia regions. And for a lot of our communities, they go, they ask me, what's this reconciliation? I haven't done anything. What have I got to reconcile about? So, it's a question I get asked all the time that, our communities don't understand, what their part plays in this role. We understand about it, recognising and putting, First Nations people at the forefront of agendas. But, for First Nations people, we don't just want it for 1 week over Reconciliation Week or over NAIDEP Week. It should be every day of the year that, we think about our, as a civil society, about our most vulnerable groups. And currently, for First Nations people, for me, those living with disability, their families and carers, they're the most vulnerable and disadvantaged, across Australia today, because, we haven't really engaged them appropriately to understand what their needs are and what their rights are. So, in the contents of the service system, it's always been about, doing for rather than doing with. So, going back to your question about reconciliation, and I'm happy to open this up to the floor. It's, for First Nations people, it's about two-way learning and about us walking together. But you can only have that two-way learning if you're actually listening. And that's what, we need in the sector. As one elder, we actually have an elders group that, is the voice for our organisation too, and we refer to them in regards to any policy, resource development and that. But one elder from the Utopia region in the Northern Territory said to me one time, if we're not listening, we can't hear them. So, reconciliation is also about deep listening and making those steps about moving forward, because if we don't listen and learn and take the time to, you know, understand the journey that people are on. And we know, you know, for our communities, you know, people are on different levels of that journey, you know, and how that impacts them, you know, in their daily life, or navigating, as I said earlier, a system that was never designed for them. So, you know, we need to break down the walls and rewrite the narrative, I would say, you know, in the service system, because, you know, we're all here for the right reasons. We know that. We're all working this system because we want to make change. But, you know, we can only make change when we're bringing those that have been left behind and shut out of the system, that they're, you know, standing alongside us and being part of that journey. So I think reconciliation, we need to think about it differently. That's what I would say, you know, in the narrative of a First Nations perspective.
Yeah, definitely, Anne. I think that, you know, you raised the yarn, and I kind of went to thinking about the word itself, because I love that play on word stuff, yeah. And I was thinking about the word itself, reconciliation. And I'm thinking to myself, as you were talking earlier, I'm going, well, how do we reconcile something that was never reconciled in the first place? How can we begin to rebuild or reestablish when in actual fact conciliation itself never took place for our mob? And I guess that's where that yarn kind of came to me, and I kind of grabbed it and looked it up in the background, I guess, around what is conciliation, in, you know, by dictionary definition, actually talks about the action of mediating between two disputing people or groups, and the action of stopping someone from being angry. And I just believed to myself, as you were talking, I'm thinking, well, did we ever console? Was there ever a conciliation as that was actually purposeful and meaningful for our communities? So yeah, I found it kind of took my brain to a new space and a new place, and I just want to thank you for that, because it made me challenge myself about the way that I view and think about Reconciliation Week, and the purpose, the outcomes from Reconciliation Week. Reconciliation Week is not a week long, as you say. You know, it's a way of being, it's a way of interacting, and it's a way of taking forward throughout the year the challenges that we set ourselves, by way of building and rebuilding one another and each other in the spaces that we work from and in. I guess for our communities, reconciliation is extra difficult because, as I said, there was never conciliation to begin in the first instance. So I think that is something that when we're working in the social service sector, if we're not keeping our eyes very open to that, and our policies, our procedures, and therefore our practice actually lead us straight to the concept of reconciling something that was never reconciled, I just wonder about whether or not we're actually launching from a false truth where it comes to the space of reconciliation. I found that really interesting, and I just want to thank you, because like you've really got my brain buzzing in that space, which is always healthy for me in my learning. But I just wanted to share that buzz with everyone else today, because I felt as though if it was my learning, then obviously it has potential to be a learning for somebody else in the space as well. I wonder, so one of the things that I find most challenging, I guess, is that concept of engagement with Aboriginal families and communities. You know, this word engagement and its consequences, you know, and even empowerment, they're words that tend to be very, very political, overused by all means. But I just wonder if the definition of empowerment or engagement or both has actually shifted and changed in your years of experience in the sector, and whether or not you see that those words are actually used and challenged properly when actually working in our families and our spaces.
Yeah, I think it is. An example for me would be just yesterday I was in Canberra with the Disability Royal Commission commissioners at a round table, and they kept using the word empowerment, and it was around restrictive practices. What does that look like? How do we change the laws? How do we give, you know, prior consent? How do we give the voice to, you know, people with disabilities, but more important, how do we give, you know, ensure that First Nations voice is heard? And I had to bring up in the room that, and I do it wherever I can, because, you know, we are empowered, we are resilient, we're not going anywhere. We've stayed on from all adversities, you know, not knowing even, you know, that we have rights as First Nations people. You know, we just keep flying that baton because we have that strong resilience, we have that strong culture. So I think, you know, we need to talk more about enhancing people's capacity, because people have capacity, and I speak, you know, generally on behalf of, you know, First Nations people with disability. They do have capacity, they do have survived, they have, you know, survived and are participating in community. But it's, you know, how do we, you know, change that narrative around, you know, what does participation really mean for, you know, our people? You know, is that enhancement really working in regards to their narrative, to where they live, or, you know, what their cultural group will be? So I think we need to, you know, come at a different level, and, you know, we need to, you know, be just speaking and understanding, and what, as we would say at FPDN, sitting down in the dirt, actually sitting down in the dirt and hearing. And, you know, for our communities, you know, there's some of the most over consulted and over surveyed, but nothing changes in their lives. So we have to think about doing business a different way, doing First Nations business, asking them how they want, you know, business conducted on their country, getting permission to conduct that business, not just assuming that, you know, the best design, you know, InDesign or web design or, you know, policy design is, you know, doing the right thing because, you know, your government contract says this is how you will deliver a program. Is it really, you know, informed by the people that you're delivered by? So I think, you know, we all need to take a rain check, as, you know, we've all learned in this, you know, last period around COVID. We've all had to, you know, sit back and reset. Yeah. And I think it's been a good thing for the sector. I guess we're more busier than ever because we're all on Zoom now, so we can't escape. But I think it's about, let's reset and really think about, you know, what we're trying to do, who is our audience, and are we really you know, engaging that audience, or we just, you know, ticking a few boxes because that's what the program says you can do it, and, you know, fumbling along, but nothing really changes. So, you know, I encourage people to, you know, look across, you know, the CRPD, the rights of a person with disability, and look at the articles that reflect in regards to your daily work, and how can that, you know, support you to understand on those rights in regards to, you know, hearing the voice, you know, hearing their story, hearing, you know, what it means to them. And a lot of our work has been done in the last period. For some of you may be aware of, the first research report that's ever been done around, you know, engaging the voice and the narrative of First Nations people living with disability is called Culture is Inclusion. And the reason I bring that up, so that research report was, you know, giving the voice to community. And we did that over, you know, 18 months, 2 years. But our only question to community when we went out was, tell us your story.
Nice.
And we didn't ask about disability. We didn't ask what their diagnosis was. We didn't ask, you know, what their living circumstances were. We didn't ask what their income was. We did not, you know, we just said, tell us your story. And it was amazing, the pages and pages of dialogue that we got from people. But what the reason again why I'm bringing that up is, you know, when we ask people to tell their story, the first thing that they said to us, no one's ever asked us that. Yeah. No one's ever asked me what my story is. And the second part of that was, it was usually up to an hour, sometimes hour and a half, 2 hours. before, you know, these individuals or community groups that we were sitting around with said to us, oh yeah, and I have a disability. We knew they had a disability, you know, whatever that disability may have been. But it wasn't first and foremost in their lives. First and foremost was, you know, living on country, being in community, having those connections, being with family. And then, you know, oh yeah, I have a disability and, you know, I may need supports in this direction, or I've been given supports, but they're not the cultural way. And an example would that be, you know, particularly to mental health. You know, we heard from particularly our men so many times they said to us, yeah, I've done all the counselling, I've done all the programs, I've done this, but it's not our way. You know, so when I still walk out of that, you know, my 1 hour counselling service and, you know, I'm walking down the road to get back home to my mission because, you know, I live on the edge of town. I'm not welcome to live in the centre of town. And a car passes me by, and I won't use the swear words here, but calls me a black sea. So that 1 hour counselling that I just did takes me right back, you know. And so, you know, these are the conversations you really deeply need to hear about how can we, you know, I mean, there's a few elements to that, as we know, it's around racism, but, you know, our people acknowledge, you know, that they live with differences, but they want to be worked and supported differently in their way, on community, in the ways that, you know, they conduct business. So again, it goes back to that deeply listening and actually hearing. And in the local language here in Darwin country, it's called Nara, and it's to listen and to hear.
Yeah,
and that's what we don't do. That's what we don't do enough. So, but also, you know, enhance our people's, you know, capacity about knowing their rights. And that's where the human rights approaches and frameworks come into. You know, you have a right to be educated. You have a right to access, you know, your community. You have a right to have appropriate equipment. You have a right to, you know, live free and be prior informed about anything that happens in your life. So, you know, collectively, it's all our work as, you know, the human service sector to inform and support people to lift up and enhance, you know, who they are and what their capacity can be to, you know, having a free and healthy life, whichever way they want that to be.
Yeah. And definitely, you know, that concept of bringing family, bringing culture alive for those that we're working with, I think is such a critical missing link in our day-to-day practice, isn't it? Like what I see across sector. I'm thinking actually, because, you know, you've got your culture as inclusion model, and, you know, I'm thinking more recently in New South Wales, there was an independent review into Aboriginal children out of home care called Family as Culture. And I think it's really interesting the language that they're even using there, you know, family is culture and culture is inclusion. It's kind of like they want to mold it together, but they just don't know how to. And of course they don't, because it's not their belonging. You know, a system doesn't know how to adopt culture, in my view. I guess what I wanted to probably share, though, on the back of your yarn there is when I came out to Nangyajarjum, and I saw that as a liberation moving away from the government sector, I was able for the first time, and, you know, you'll have to excuse my blunt language here when I say for the first time ever, I was able to be black at work. Yeah, I was actually able to be Aboriginal in the workspace and be comfortable with being an Aboriginal woman, and not feeling as though I needed to leave my culture at the door as I entered the office and pick it back up as I left the office each day. I think, so I had the opportunity to develop a program, a family preservation program, by the name of Gumagoy. We call it Gumagoy Way. Gumagoy in local dialect means family. So it's the family way. Gumagoy was developed and not based, I guess, as a copy and paste from funding agreements with KPIs or business rules or guidelines, practice guidelines or whatever that were given to us as part to our contracts. Instead, when the Gumagoy Way was developed, it was developed uniquely from the viewpoint and of the experience of the family who would be using our program. So when that program was developed, it was very much developed from what would this feel like? What would this behave like? What would the family get out of this? What would the family be seeing, feeling, and experiencing as we implement this part of this policy? And it was really developed purely from the family's experience and then married back to what our contractual KPIs and numbers, data stuff should be looking like. And I think in that way, the Gumagoy Way was entirely unique for their sector because it grew from the family's experience and not from the contract's expectations, I guess. And I wonder, you know, if our KPIs in the sector were actually measured in accordance with how many families came to us, as opposed to us going to our communities or our families, I actually wonder, you know, if we weren't door knocking for the work to meet our KPIs in accordance with our contracts, and instead the families were nominating their own key performance indicators by coming to us, you know, I actually wonder how much different our contracts could actually look, how much more aggressive, how much more informative, and how much deeper the purpose would be in our families and our communities, especially rural and remote communities, regional communities across New South Wales. I think that there's a great opportunity to really go and revisit the way that the designs have happened for policies and procedures, and challenge ourselves to look at that through the experience of the family. What is the family's experience of our program rather than our program's experience of the families that we're working with, if that doesn't sound too double Dutchy. But I guess, yeah, I find that really interesting. It's something that we often challenge ourselves for. I know recently with the flooding events here in northern New South Wales, we've had a chance to look seriously at the opportunities for Aboriginal community controlled organisations and the way we respond in times of crisis. We know where our families are. We know where the most vulnerable of the families are. We know what resources generally most families have available to them, which are more resourceful or which are less resourceful. So I look at the floods here in northern New South Wales and the role that Aboriginal community controlled organisations, even some Aboriginal community businesses took in that forefront of making sure that meeting the immediate needs of our families and communities was at the front. And an example of that was, you know, the astounding work of the Koori Mail and the astounding work even of our CEO at Nungajarjan in making sure that community needs were being put forward. Some of those resources that were untapped was those family and kinship netting, that webbing that we know exists. The Koori grapevine was, you know, just absolutely priceless for making sure that information was shared in a timely way. And we knew how many of our Aboriginal families were on roofs waiting for rescuing. So all of those things, those untapped resources around what we know works for our people. And yet there was no policy, there was no procedure, there was no guideline that actually could have met that because, or filled those gaps because we hadn't been invited to the table around those issues. So it's really, and yeah, I'm not having a go, please know what the SES do or how they go about their business, because I think what they do is downright astounding, given that, you know, especially such a voluntary, strong organisation. But what I'm saying is that the experience of the family is not embedded in their models of operation. Their model of operation works from an oppressive concept that people in need to be grateful for having their needs met. So it oppresses our people. That oppression then leads to dependency. So there becomes a dependency on systems for our people to have their needs met through these systems and through these quiet bias policies, procedures and practices, and then which then cycles back around to a model of disempowerment. So the whole cycle of, I guess, looking at that cycle and how that works, how that gets flipped into an empowerment model is only when we remove the oppressive behaviour from the systems that are actually involved in our families. Whether or not we're doing that in the context of first responders in emergencies, whether or not that we're doing that in our day-to-day practice as social service deliverers, I guess that's an opportunity for us to have a closer look at that. What are your thoughts there on?
Yeah, I think, there's a big conversation here, but just when you were talking, I think a natural example here would be, if I put it back into the contents that some in the audience here might want to understand in their working life is, for Aboriginal communities, it's about that yarning circle and coming together and acknowledging who are, the leaders in that, who, which goes back to, earlier days when we were allowed to practice culture, allowed to, communities led their own business. And that's what happened up in, the Northern Rivers. Community just got on and led their business and identified the elders. They didn't need bureaucracy to come in. So how I want to put it back into the contents of the service system and the human rights approach is, so, with the human rights approach, and, people have a right to practice culture and participate, as First Nations people or as, those living with a disability in regards to the Committee on the Rights of, those with a disability. I'll give an example how that would look in your contents. So we take the Guardianship Board. So that's a white man law. It's not an Aboriginal law as in LORE. So we say, that people, if they don't have the capacity to stop themselves from self-harm or the capacity to operate their daily activities, they must come under a ruling, for example, with the Guardianship Board, who will say when, how, their life operates daily and weekly. But in the Aboriginal contents and the human rights contents, it comes back to that social model of care, which is, we say society creates the barriers to people participating. So when we lived as, traditionally as First Nations group on country, we had our LORE and everyone had a place in that culture, in the way they operated, how communities operated. But when we were asked to transition into other narratives that were designed or we weren't asked to be a part of or we weren't informed of, it created barriers in the system for our communities. So, if we talk about an example of the Guardianship Board, that when, a person comes under that guardianship label, their cultural practice or their standing in community is not taken into account, or who is the spokesperson on their behalf in account, is not taken into account. But when we take it back to a First Nations perspective, when we have an individual that may not have the capacity to participate like others in the community or are living with differences, it's usually within First Nations perspective, a whole of community approach. There's not just one person in that person's life. There may be many layers, in that person's life. It might be their immediate family, might be their extended family, It might be their other community people in their family, and everyone has a role in that person's life to support them to participate or live within that community. It's only when they go outside that community that the barriers start coming up against them, like can they access, Redfern Station if they have a wheelchair, for example, because there's only one lift there. That's what we talk about, the society barriers. Or when they, as a First Nations person that may have English or a third and fourth language, when they go to navigate the NDIS or some other service system, is that, language appropriate to them? Is that documentation appropriate for their learning capacity? So when we talk about the stolen generations, a lot of those children had a criminal record. So it stops them from participating and getting employment because they got a criminal record through no fault of their own, because they were talked as abandoned children, which gave them a criminal record. So when we go back to that, human rights approach, create the barriers. The human rights approach in regards in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of People, First Nations people, is about they have a right to participate and pursue their cultural practices. And that's does not happen with the service system. So getting back to my original conversation, for an example, with the Guardianship Board, we now have a colonial construct that says you must be appointed an outside element to conduct your business, where cultural contents, it's, community business, it's family business. So for me, being the eldest in my immediate family and the eldest granddaughter, I'm assigned certain things within my family unit because that is my role as the eldest. An example would be, my mother passed a couple of years back. And in that journey, when I was speaking to the doctor, they go, have you... And I went, no. And he goes, oh, well, I, think you should go out and get power of attorney, for your mother's business. But I didn't have to, and I never did, because everyone knew I was the eldest. I was in charge of my mother's business. I was the eldest granddaughter for the extended family. Again, I was in control of that women's business. I organised everything. I did everything. Yeah. So when we put systems and programs in the contents of bureaucracy or, colonialism versus First Nations rights, they're two different pathways. Yeah. But how do we work collectively together to bring those pathways into the right pathway so there's no bumpy roads and everyone can navigate, respectfully together?
And I'm a firm believer that can happen. And I mentioned earlier the Gumagoi Way and the development of that practice model for intensive family preservation service that Nanya Jarjum developed. I guess in that model actually talks really strongly to family-led decision-making in our day-to-day practice. So to bring those yarn and circles together for the family, including the whole of family kinship, those with significant roles around those Jarjums, around those parents, and the differing roles across the community around who steps in when and where. Because like you say, culturally, we know those rules. And those that have been disconnected from culture through no fault of their own, maybe they're descendants of those that were taken, or maybe they were taken themselves. It's interesting that you raised the criminal charges of people who were removed under the old policy and the impact that has, because that still has a very, very real and live impact even today, that, you know, people were criminally charged because they had been taken from their families, which gave them criminal records and actually has impacted their whole capacity to be able to develop. It's really interesting that you raise that, because it's a nice reminder of some of the impact of those policies of the past, even the policies of the current. I know yesterday I was in a meeting with DCJ, where DCJ, New South Wales, were able to own the fact that the assessment tools that they're using are intrinsically lead to racist decision making for our children, which is why they've got them under review at the moment. And I found that really bold and really brave for a government department to actually own the fact that their tools, their decision making trees and tools, actually hold that bias, and, you know, as such would stand in you know, I guess as such, yeah. I wonder about that moulding back to the international rights of Indigenous peoples. But anyway, I'm sure that they are very aware of where they stand in that space. I think, yeah, but the opportunity even for programs like family preservation to look at family-led decision making, making sure we're bringing families around the table to make decisions, and knowing each family, knowing where their strengths and weaknesses are, and knowing where to throw in the resources, or where they can reach out for the right resources to actually implement their own plans. That actually becomes that empowerment model that doesn't form dependency on a system. And I think that that's what really our way of working and our way of being would actually promote, is being given the freedom to do that properly means that we actually wouldn't be systems dependent. Therefore, we wouldn't be subjected so much to an oppressive way of practice from a government agency. And therefore, the round circle is that we would be an empowered people and able to make more decisions ourselves, and be able to, you know, I guess, live but in accordance with some of those rights outlined in the International Rights of Indigenous Peoples that you mentioned. Did you have, I guess I'm just curious about things that you've done in your practice that actually have brought family-led decision making or something along those lines to your part of the sector, and challenged other services to look that way. Because as I'm kind of coming up into that space, I want to know a little bit more, I guess, about your experience of it all.
Yeah, so for us also, we're not a service provider, so we're systemic peak. So we do policy to government. We do have programs. So, you know, currently we're working with the Disability Royal Commission. So part of our, you know, systemic advocacy work was, you know, for the last 10 years with all the national disability peaks, was to get the Royal Commission happening and change that narrative around, you know, how people work and see people with disabilities. So that's more our line of work. The NDIS, you know, we fought for that with all the other disability advocates for, you know, 10, 15 years to get that on the table. But again, you know, our vision of the NDIS was that social model of care versus that medical model care that's saying, you know, people can be fixed, where the social model of care is about society creates the barriers, and it was never meant to be diagnostic based or label based. So that's an issue for us. And, you know, the scheme has moved to more a market economy rather than a human services economy. So we have real issues with it. But an example, how, you know, we've worked with community, what community needs are, would be the NDIS. So in the early days, all the, you know, literature and paraphernalia and brochures was all very text heavy, and, you know, wasn't culturally appropriate for our community to understand what this scheme meant for them. So in consultations with many communities across Australia, we sat down and produced a product that's called Our Way Planning. So it had no literature, no narrative, no writing in it. It was all storytelling with artwork, and we developed an animated video to go with it. But the concept was, for it didn't matter what disability you had, the way we designed the resource book for communities to use to help them build a plan and understand what the NDIS was in their life. We used stickers at the back, and they were culturally appropriate stickers, which we said to many communities and individuals, you can use your own stickers, but we use, you know, yarning circles and, you know, other cultural elements, but, you know, we use the traditional stuff about going shopping or needing transport, but it was a variety of things that people could use the stickers. So the resource was about, you know, walking alongside someone again, tell us your story. But in regards to a person with disability, tell us your story, but what keeps you strong in community? So that was the narrative we use. What keeps you strong with your family? So what supports may you need to keep you strong with that family? What keeps you, you know, strong in, you know, other elements of your life, you know, getting out in community or participating in events? What do you need? So we changed the narrative around about, you know, rather than a deficit base, as a positive base, as what keeps you strong, what makes you happy, but what do you need to participate in those elements of your life, whether it's family, community, culture, or other parts of your life. So I think that was, you know, again, goes back to that, you know, the human rights framework that, you know, empowering people, you know, creating autonomy, you know, with people around, you know, how to participate, rather than looking at the deficit model ago, labeling a person. So in our communities, this is why, you know, disability is a different conversation in the sector. Is we're not about labeling people, you know, autism, cerebral palsy, you know, physical disability, acquired brain injury. It's very a Western construct. In our communities, it's more about, you know, look out for that fellow over there. He may, you know, walk differently or hear differently or see differently, but it's just about looking out for them and ensuring that they're involved. So it's not about the labeling and diagnostic, you know, so that's why for a lot of the sector and the way the service system is run, it's all about labeling and, you know, talking about, you know, your worst day, you know, not talking about, you know, so an individual that may, you know, have intergenerational trauma and suffer from mental health. We don't talk about what they can't do. We talk about more about, well, on your best day, you know, how do you participate? How do you, you know, get up and about, you know, whether that's 1 hour a day or, you know, a couple of hours a day. It's not about, you know, looking at the deficit model that you don't leave the house and how can we make you leave the house and you need to participate and you need to get a job and you need to do this. It's very a Western construct about that, rather than sitting down and yarning and coming together, how we can support you to be your best, because everyone's best is different. You, I, everyone on this Zoom meeting today, we all come from a different walk of life and different circumstances. But, you know, how we present is how we're enabled to allow that presentation to happen. We're not, you know, everyone's not the experts in each other's lives, so we shouldn't pretend to be. But, you know, if we are understanding where a person comes from and how their needs can be met around those human rights principles of self-determination, we'll have a better end game, I think, in the end for, you know, our communities across this country. That was a bit long-winded, wasn't it?
No,
I don't know where I was going there. Sorry, people.
Look, it was so on point, though, Aunt. I think because it actually took my brain back to my younger days, where I used to, when I grew up, as I grew up, it was always, we didn't have labels, like you said. It was just kind of, oh, that one there, you know, a little bit. We had words, like we might have had mogul, or we might have had, you know, words that indicated a little bit not a little bit different in different ways, but we never really labelled people weren't seen to have disabilities per se, not the way the government defines it, but instead people were just seen to be who it was they were. And if that meant that they happened to be a little bit different, then that's just who they were. So, which is why I think I've always struggled with the concept of disability, because to me it was more just, oh no, that's just who that person is. And it wasn't kind of seen. And so the concept of how do we make sure that those resources are around that person for them to make the best, have the most access, or how do we make culture come alive around that person and hold that person in safety, is such a really critical part of the yarn that we're having today. I think you were right on the money with it, with where that yarn went to. I think what the other thing it made me do was think a little bit more about the Gumagoy way, and the way that we could, as an agency, look to make sure that we are asking our families to hold our families in safety a lot more than without that very prescribed way that our contracts determine the way that we will respond in a family, if that makes sense, where I'm heading in my brain with where you've led me. Because there's a great opportunity for us to take a lot closer look at how we get the family to hold the family, or ask the family what they would like to be able to hold each other in safety, rather than actually prescribing those outcomes. You know, I gave a presentation a couple of years ago now at a forum where I was able to talk quite openly to those pre-written prescriptions we have for issues, and you talk about it in the context of diagnoses in disability. But you know, that if a family is presenting with mental health concerns or family violence concerns, it's like there are these unwritten prescriptions that say, you know, it's drug and alcohol, therefore they've got to go to detox for 6 weeks, then they can go to rehab for 6 months, and then we'll talk about whether or not they can have a relationship with their children again. It's like these unwritten prescriptions that have formed over time about how the system responds and reacts to the needs of families. Or in cases of family violence, then it's like, yes, well, let's get that apprehended violence order in place. It's up to the victim to implement that violence order and to action it. Huge responsibility for somebody who's at risk of harm to put the responsibility on them to action the AVO. But anyway, we won't go there. And then, you know, there's a bundle of service delivery that goes around that, maybe staying home, staying safe programs, or whatever it might be around addressing family violence. So it's like these prescriptions that sit beside each of the key indicators, and at no stage do those prescriptions actually go to the kinship network and say, how would you like, what do you need to make the support come alive for you to hold your family member safely, or those jargons in safety, so that we can, and then our professional responsibility would be then to go and make sure that those resources were around that family for them to be able to implement their own plan about how they're going to address it. Now, if that meant going bush, you know, if that meant going back to country, if that meant whatever that could mean, yarn and circles with aunts, if that, you know, then that is the part that needs to be resourced. It doesn't need to be resourced as a prescription to say that, yes, you're going to go and do your 6 weeks rehab, or 6 weeks detox, 6 months rehab, and then we can tick the box to say that you can have contact with your jargons again. Do you know where I'm heading there? That's where you got me thinking. So you've taken me to a much broader space. So thank you.
You know, what's important, all of us have to keep revisiting, as you said, you know, whether Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander, or non-Aboriginal, or from the Cord communities, you know, we have to revisit all the time the work that we do, and not sit in our laurels and not be, you know, keyboard warriors. And an example would that be, as I said, when we first developed that NDIS planning book, we done it initially for, you know, remote inland communities. But then when we started utilising it more on the East Coast and we went up to far north Queensland, it was actually Auntie Benita Marbo, God bless her, that said to us, where's the saltwater people voice? Where's my voice in this? I can't see my voice. I can't see my people, my culture. Where's this Torres Strait Islander voice? And we went, oh, sorry, Aunt. So we don't get it right. That's what I'm trying to say, as a collective, as a community, as, hearing the voice, we all, need to progress and move forward. And it's about keep having those conversations. So, 3 times we end up redoing that particular resource because, when we took it out to community, we listened and we heard what they said. Where's this? Where's that? I can't see me in that, so it's about, evolving and listening to community needs because, as a sector, we know collectively for some maybe in this room today, and I've been around a long time, what we did 10, 20, 30 years ago is a different story today in the regards to the way we work or the way we write our policies because we're all better informed. We all, we've all evolved to, hopefully go paperless because we're worried about the climate, and things like that. So I think, there's no right way or wrong way collectively. It's about, stopping and as I said, reassessing ourselves all the time and going, am I inclusive of, the particular community I'm working in? Have I really heard what their needs are? Yes, a contract came out to put in for ILC funding or whatever funding you're putting in for. But is that really the need for the community? Just because there's, the government or the state put out, funding rounds, is it really what that community wants? Do they want a new football field or a new sporting program? Or is it really, they want more accessibility in their community, or they want to learn about, community gardening so they can be more self-sufficient. Yeah. So I think, it's time to, and we at FPDN are doing the same, we all got to sometimes sit back and regroup and go, are we truly that voice for the people we're representing? And I think we need to do that, constantly and reevaluate, what our mission is, what our visions are. Yeah. And is it that, are we really the voice or telling the story for those that, we're working alongside with or walking alongside with?
Yeah, that is so true, isn't it? And, I don't doubt, we all come to work every day with a solid intent to represent our people as best as we can, to meet the needs of those families and communities that we're servicing with the best intent. But I think, almost like this yarn's coming to a full circle here, Aunt, when I go back to where you started, and I kind of think to myself, where you started today was very much talking about the need for us to take, I guess, that energy that we come to our daily work with and continue that evolving process of learning that we've been doing. It's been my privilege to be a part of being challenged by you today, and I hope that some of the other people, and I tend to forget these other people are here on Zoom with us.
Can't see anyone. Where are you all?
Only because I'm a little bit taken in with what your yarn's been about and the journey that I've been on of challenging myself. So I just want to say thanks for that, and I hope that everyone else enjoyed it as much as I did.
I hope they didn't fall asleep.
No, I would call it a transformative learning moment myself, because it's just been, I want to really thank you for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us, and want to just maybe ask one question and then take questions. But I think the way you started with talking about self-determination and the International Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, especially affirming self-determination as a central right of that declaration, as all other rights support First Nations exercise of self-determination. And I think that was in my mind in March, because Senator Lydia Thorpe put up in March a private senator's bill to make the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People a part of the laws, policies and practice of this country. I'm really interested to hear from both of you what that would mean. Like, what would that make a difference? What would that mean in the work you're doing at the moment? And what would that mean at both the individual and community levels?
Yeah, I mean, personally, our work is informed by, both those declarations. So it wouldn't really change how we work. I think on a community and individual level, it's like anyone in community or, personally, when you feel valued and you feel acknowledged and you feel heard, your whole language, body language, community language, changes. And I think, for First Nations people, what I see, working across this country, and it's not for all, and I'm not being disrespectful at all to our communities or individuals, but there's just such a sense of disempowerment. And I think giving that voice, if we can get the voice to Parliament through the Makarrata. I mean, people ask, an example, I think a simple example would be, why do the Maori community feel so proud? Because they have a treaty, and until we're acknowledged that, we're not asking for extras, we just want to be acknowledged and respected. And I think that's what it'll make that change for people. You still will see poverty, you'll still see disadvantage, you'll still see disillusionment, but in general, as individuals, as communities, as nations, as, tribes, as mobs, we'll feel validated. And I think the narrative in Australia is, we don't feel validated as a people. Yeah. I mean, me, I'm a bit older than everyone else on this today. I was not a citizen of this country when I was born. Let that sit. It's a really weird concept that this is my country. I was born here. I was born on country. I'm from Nambucca Heads, we've got some of the strongest activists. My cousin is Gary Foley, but we had to fight for every natural way of living and surviving, whether it's medical centres, whether it's legal centres, whether it's access to services, what people have to remember, the history of, First Nations people is around what we would call is sit-down money. That's where the welfare system came from, that disempowerment. We weren't acknowledged. So we were asked to sit down and give them flour, tea and water, and the consequences are the health implications of today. So when you take around, disempower our elders, our men, other things happen in, communities. So I think, to have that voice, have that recognition will just change the body language. That's how I look at it. Yeah.
Yeah. And Paula, I guess from my perspective, I just can't agree with Aunt more, give us flour, tea and water and tell us to be grateful. But anyway, I guess from my perspective, the work we do at Guardianship is informed by the international rights of Indigenous peoples and the international rights of the child. I guess what I want to say, though, is the opportunity to embed this in practice, to actually hold agencies accountable. But I guess the other thing I see is the great opportunity and unique opportunity for us to design programs with our own KPIs developed and identified by our families and communities. So rather than having the government identify or prescribe what it is that we're going to deliver, actually having those family and communities design and describe what it is they want delivered. I think that that's probably one of the key differences that I would like to see happen if we actually got to that space where we could actually go and, I talked before about prescriptions for, that the government tends to follow and thinks that it's going to work and yet keeps going back and doing the same thing. It's not working. So I wonder, for me, to actually have that embedded would be an opportunity for us to design more programs like the Gumagoi Way, where we could actually put the experience of our families into the models that we're designing, and actually have it built from what we want the family to get out of our models, rather than from what the government's telling us we need to prescribe for those communities.
I love the comment from Nicole. I wish all the new federal government ministers were on this session. Thank you. Everything you said here, especially about truly listening and hearing exactly how things will improve. It would be so important for the new Minister of Social Services, Amanda Rishwell, to listen to this yarning session. So I think
we send them.
yeah, we send the recording. I think that speaks for all of us. Thank you so much. What a blessing. And as I said, it feels, I always go with my feel, it feels transformative learning for me. Amrit.
Absolutely. It was the most insightful discussions. And as I said at the start, it's actually been a privilege just sitting and listening. And, you know, I've been making notes, and you know, I've been sort of trying to I'm a very visual person, so I've been trying to put some sort of a diagram around it. And I just came as looking at language is a construct, and how that then encourages labeling. Deficit models leads to ticking of boxes to access. And then with the market economy, you know, how do we actually change this? And if we really want to bring in a change, we'll have to move away from all these ticking the boxes, relating, you know, and looking at our own practice on day-to-day basis. And this large corporatization of the sector, is that the prescribed way to help families? It's not. And to me, it's looking at systems in context, and it's the colonial versus the First Nations rights models that we basically need to look into our planning. We need to look into our systems. We need to take into account everyday cultural practice and day-to-day practice, not just across one sector, but across sectors, across client groups. And that's the key pillar of how we are actually going to really make any change into our practice. Thank you once again from the bottom of my heart. And it's actually been one of the most privileged discussions, you know, to be part of.
Well, it's always a journey together, you know. There's no one, as I said earlier, right way or wrong way. It's coming together, and, you know, and how do you interwove, you know, that journey, that spiritual dreaming, you know, it's a construct, you know, the campfires and listening, and, you know, the weather, how it impacts, and you know, our daily activities. So they're all the things we need to align ourselves with, to, you know, because we are human, you know, like we're not a commodity.
It's Elise Kane from NCOSS here. Just thank you, Paula and Amrit, for your sort of closing comments there, really nicely kind of encapsulating some of the amazing things we've heard today. And of course, thank you so much, Michelle and Auntie June, for joining us today, for your incredibly valuable time, for sharing your insights and your experiences with us. You know, I think I speak for everyone on the call today when I say that, you know, it's just felt like such a privilege to be witness to such an incredible conversation between two incredible women, and just really so thought-provoking and enlightening. And the word of the day is transformative. So thank you so much. I know Rosalita's about to put up a feedback poll for anyone who's still on the line and has a bit of time to tell us what you thought. Please do. And look, again, thank you from the bottom of our hearts for sharing your time and your wisdom with us today. It's been a fantastic experience and a privilege. Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, June.
Thanks, Michelle. So
thanks, and Boogabeh, to all. So that's thank you for joining.
yeah, we'll catch you again soon. Take care.
Thank you.